She was the kind of girl whose presence softened even the harshest morning. When she walked through the narrow paths of the village, people often paused to notice the gentle rhythm in her steps, the way her eyes carried the calmness of water untouched by storm. She greeted children with warm smiles, shared food with those who had none, and often spent long afternoons caring for the elderly who had been forgotten by their own kin. Her hands, though young, were always busy, weaving mats, grinding grain, gathering firewood, and yet she never once complained of her burdens. To those who saw only her surface, she appeared simple and ordinary, but to those who truly watched, she carried a rare brightness, a purity that seemed untouched by the cruelty around her. It was this very brightness, however, that drew shadows toward her. In the village, kindness was not always rewarded. People lived with envy hidden in their hearts, masking it with smiles during the day and whispers when darkness came. Some looked at the girl and felt that her gentleness was a quiet rebuke to their own hardness. Others thought she carried too much affection from the spirits, too much grace for someone born among them. They wondered, how could she, who owned nothing of wealth or power, command such quiet attention? The children adored her, often gathering around her hut to hear her soft voice tell stories of rivers and stars. The elders listened when she sang, claiming her songs reminded them of days long past. Even the animals seemed to trust her, for stray dogs followed her, and birds perched closer when she worked in the fields. Such things might have seemed harmless, yet in the hearts of the envious, they became seeds of bitterness. At first, the whispers were faint. Women spoke among themselves as they pounded grain. "Have you noticed how she carries herself as if she is blessed above us?" Men muttered while drinking palm wine, "Her eyes are too clear, too knowing. Surely, such a girl must be touched by something unnatural." Even some elders, threatened by the respect she unintentionally commanded, shook their heads and declared that too much innocence in one place could not be trusted. These murmurs began to curl around her like creeping vines, invisible yet relentless, wrapping tighter as the days passed. She herself was unaware of the storm that brewed against her. She moved through her days with the same quiet diligence, believing that her small acts of kindness might shield her from malice. When she shared her last portion of food with a hungry child, she thought it would bring gratitude. When she helped an ill neighbor fetch water, she believed it would earn trust. Yet every act seemed to sharpen the envy of those who watched. The more good she did, the more others felt accused by her existence, as if her light revealed their darkness. And so, kindness became her curse. One evening, she lingered by the river, watching the sun set into fire and gold. A group of young women passed behind her, their laughter loud and sharp. She turned, smiling, hoping to join their warmth, but their eyes avoided hers. One whispered loud enough for her to hear, "Look at her, pretending to be pure while she only seeks attention." Another added, "Even the spirits must tire of her endless tears when she thinks no one is looking." Their words cut her deeper than they knew, but she held her silence. She went home that night and sat in the dim glow of her hearth, wondering why her love for people seemed to return as scorn. The cruelty grew bolder with time. Children, once playful in her company, were taught by their parents to tease her. They sang mocking songs that twisted her name into something ugly. Men who had once admired her gentleness now spat as she passed, muttering that she carried ill fortune in her shadow. Women accused her of stealing affection that belonged to others, though she never sought it. Even the elders, who had once listened to her voice with respect, now waved her away, declaring her songs dangerous to the order of the village. It was as if the world she knew had turned its back on her, leaving her alone in the same place she had once called home. She still tried to hold on to her heart, though it grew heavier each day. She woke before dawn to fetch water, but at the well, others jostled her aside, claiming her presence would sour the water. She brought food to a sick neighbor, only to have it thrown back at her with accusations of witchcraft. At night, she wept silently, pressing her face into her hands so no one would hear. But tears, like secrets, have a way of slipping into the world, and her sorrow became another reason for scorn. "She cries too much," they said. "Her tears are not the tears of a girl but of a spirit plotting against us." Still, she endured, carrying herself with the same quiet grace, though every step was weighted with loneliness. Her life, once filled with laughter and shared warmth, became an endless test of endurance. And as she walked through the village, shadows stretched behind her, long and thick, whispering of the cruelty that circled her, whispering of a fate that no kindness could escape. The whispers that once floated like smoke in the daylight thickened into deliberate plans once night came. Behind closed doors, where the fire burned low and shadows clung to the walls, those who hated her gathered. It was not one enemy, nor a single act of malice, but the slow weaving of a net made of envy and fear. Her step-kin, who had long resented her presence, claimed she was the reason for their misfortunes. Since she came into this house, her stepmother muttered with a voice like venom, food spoils faster and joy does not last. She is cursed, and she will drag us all into ruin if we do not end it. Others nodded, eager to lay blame where none belonged. In their hearts they carried secret jealousies, but on their lips, they shaped their lies as if they were truths. By the time the moon had risen, the small gathering had turned into a council of cruelty. Villagers slipped from hut to hut, whispering of what must be done before the dawn arrived. They spoke of spirits, of omens, of a darkness that would swallow the village if the girl remained alive. It was easier for them to claim fear than to admit envy. Better her life than ours, one man said. Better her blood in the ground than curses on our children. And though none could point to a true sign of danger, they fed each other's dread with every word, weaving a story in which she was no longer an innocent girl but the vessel of their imagined doom. The decision was made quickly, for cruelty, once stirred, does not rest. Before the first light of day they said she must be silenced. Some wanted it to be swift, a knife in the dark, a push into the river. Others demanded a ritual, a burial beneath the earth to ensure her spirit would not return. The sun must rise without her shadow in this world, her stepmother hissed, eyes gleaming with a hunger that was more than hatred. If she remains when morning comes, our lives will be cursed. She must be buried before sunrise. Her words settled into the hearts of the gathered like stones dropped into water, heavy and final. So they began their preparations in silence. Men sharpened blades under the cover of night, their faces lit faintly by the glint of metal. Women carried ropes and cloths, whispering prayers to the spirits as though cruelty could be cleansed if wrapped in ritual words. Even the elders, who should have been guardians of wisdom, muttered their approval, convincing themselves that sacrifice was better than risk. No one spoke of kindness, no one dared defend the girl. It was as though her light had blinded them all to their own darkness, and now that darkness ruled. Meanwhile she slept, unaware of the storm gathering outside her fragile walls. She lay curled on her mat, her breath steady, her dreams still touched with hope despite the coldness of the village around her. Shadows slid across her doorway as figures gathered, watching, waiting for the moment to strike. The silence of the night was broken only by the rustle of rope, the clink of metal, and the murmurs of betrayal. In their hearts, some trembled, not from pity but from fear that the spirits might see them. Yet none turned back, for once hatred takes root in a crowd, it demands loyalty to cruelty. Her stepmother was the first to step forward. She placed her hand against the girl's door, her face twisted with triumph masked as resolve. "She will not see another sunrise," she whispered to those behind her. "She will not bring ruin upon us. Before the first rooster crows, the earth will close over her." And with those words the plot was sealed. The night grew colder, as though the very air recoiled from what was to come. Clouds crept across the sky, shrouding the moon, leaving the village in a dim, uneasy gloom. The conspirators took it as a sign, not of warning but of permission. They convinced themselves that the spirits agreed with their plan, that the shadows themselves guided their hands. And so, as the hours crept toward dawn, they prepared to drag the innocent girl into darkness, their hearts beating not with guilt, but with a dreadful excitement that cruelty often brings when it believes itself justified. The plan was simple in its cruelty: bind her, silence her, and bury her deep enough that the world would forget her by morning. They imagined the earth swallowing her cries, the sunrise washing away their guilt, and life continuing as if she had never existed. But in their eagerness, they did not see that fate had already turned its eyes upon them. For though they believed themselves masters of her destiny, the night itself had begun to listen, and the very air seemed to wait, heavy with an unseen promise that innocence buried unjustly never stays beneath the soil. The hour before dawn was the darkest, and in that suffocating silence they came for her. Rough hands pulled her from her sleep, ropes tightening around her wrists before her eyes even opened fully. She gasped, confused, struggling against the sudden violence, but her cries were quickly smothered by cloth pressed against her mouth. Her stepmother's face loomed close, twisted not with love but with cold determination. "Do not fight," she hissed. "This is your fate." The girl's wide eyes filled with tears, but no mercy shone in the faces surrounding her. They dragged her from her mat into the night, her bare feet scraping against the hard ground. She looked around desperately for a familiar face, someone to shield her, to question the cruelty unfolding, but all she saw were neighbors and kin who turned their eyes away, their silence heavier than any rope. Her pleas came out muffled, her body thrashing weakly, but each attempt only tightened their grip. To them, she was no longer a child of the village, no longer flesh and spirit. She was a burden to be hidden away, a shadow to be erased before the first light of dawn. The earth had already been prepared. On the edge of the forest, in a hollow where the trees bent low, a pit yawned open, freshly dug, its sides damp and smelling of soil. The conspirators stood around it like priests of some grim ritual, their breaths steaming in the cold air. One man held the spade still streaked with dirt, his hands trembling though he tried to steady them. Another clutched the rope binding her, avoiding her gaze as though her eyes carried curses. Only the stepmother looked straight at her, lips curling into a smile both triumphant and cruel. They lowered her roughly into the pit. The girl stumbled as her feet sank into the damp soil, the ropes around her arms pinning her helplessly. She shook her head violently, screaming through the gag, but her voice was swallowed by the trees. Panic surged through her, the walls of earth rose high around her, a cage of dirt closing in. She tried to climb, tried to throw herself upward, but rough hands pushed her back down. Each time she rose, they forced her to kneel in the mud. "Stay down," her stepmother snapped. "The earth will take what it is owed." The first shovelful of dirt landed on her feet, cold and heavy. She jerked back, terror flooding her face, but another followed, and then another. Soil splattered against her legs, dust filling the pit. The villagers moved quickly, their shovels cutting into the ground with a rhythm that sounded almost like a chant. The girl's cries grew frantic, muffled sobs tearing from her throat as dirt reached her knees. She kicked weakly, but her bound limbs betrayed her. Her tears mingled with the soil, streaking her cheeks with mud. The stepmother bent over the pit, watching with a gaze as sharp as a blade. "By sunrise," she whispered, "you will be nothing but silence." The others avoided meeting the girl's eyes, shoveling faster, desperate to end the task before their resolve faltered. Dirt climbed past her waist, then her chest, pinning her body with its weight. Her head jerked back, eyes wide with terror, as if begging the heavens to see her. At last, the soil reached her shoulders, then her neck. She shook her head desperately, muffled screams tearing into the night, but her words were lost. One final shovelful rained down, covering her face, her sobs silenced beneath the earth. The pit was filled, the ground smooth, the evidence buried. They pressed the soil down with their feet as though stamping out her existence. When it was done, the villagers stood in a tense circle, their breaths ragged, the silence suffocating. Some crossed themselves, muttering prayers to cleanse their guilt. Others turned quickly away, unable to face the mound that marked her grave. The stepmother lingered longest, her eyes cold, her mouth set in grim satisfaction. "The sun will rise without her," she said, as if to convince herself as much as the others. But the earth was not still. Beneath the freshly packed soil, her heart still beat, weak but unyielding. The weight pressed down, the darkness closed in, yet something in the air felt unsettled. The night had swallowed her, yes, but it had not forgotten. The earth had taken her body, but it trembled faintly, as if reluctant to keep what had been unjustly offered. The soil pressed against her face, heavy and unrelenting, filling her mouth and nose with its bitter taste. Every breath became a battle, every gasp cut short by grains that forced their way into her lungs. Her chest heaved, straining against the crushing weight, her body thrashing in the darkness. She tried to scream, but the sound dissolved into silence, swallowed by the earth that entombed her. Her terror was beyond words, it was raw instinct, the desperate fight of a soul not ready to be smothered. Her mind flickered between fragments of memory and the stark reality of death closing in. She saw sunlight glinting on river water, the laughter of children, the warmth of her sister's hand once clasped in hers. But the soil pressed harder, smothering thought itself, replacing it with primal fear. Her body convulsed, every muscle burning as she clawed against the ropes binding her, fingernails scraping uselessly at the dirt. The earth was everywhere, in her ears, in her throat, against her eyelids that she squeezed shut as if that could keep the dark from consuming her. Her tears came freely, but even they betrayed her. Each tear slid into the dirt, vanishing instantly as if the earth was drinking her sorrow. For a moment she thought she felt her sister's voice in her mind, urging her not to surrender, but the soil muffled everything, even hope. The weight grew heavier, her chest burned, her throat clawed for air that would not come. She thought of the villagers above, their feet pressing down the mound, sealing her fate without a flicker of mercy. But the earth was not as loyal to them as they believed. Beneath the suffocating soil, something stirred, subtle at first like the faintest hum in the bones of the ground. Her body, trembling in despair, pressed against it unknowingly, and the hum grew stronger. The weight of the soil shifted slightly, almost as though unseen hands were moving grains aside, refusing to let her be consumed entirely. Her blood pounded in her ears, her vision fading though her eyes were shut. She thought this must be death, the slipping away of the self. Yet within that haze she felt something ancient awaken. It was not mercy, not comfort, but a force vast and indifferent, stirred by injustice. The earth's hum became a pulse, syncing with her faltering heartbeat. Her terror remained, but it was no longer hers alone. It had been answered. The roots of trees above quivered, stretching deeper into the soil, brushing against her bound limbs as if acknowledging her presence. Stones shifted, creating small pockets of air near her lips, just enough to steal a ragged breath. The suffocation paused, not ended but delayed, as if some unseen power was granting her time. Her mind, fractured by panic, latched onto this small reprieve. With every shuddering breath, she felt her body changing, not stronger but bound to something larger than herself. In the silence beneath the earth, she began to hear whispers, not of people but of the soil, the water seeping through roots, the air trapped between layers of dirt. They were not words, not yet, but vibrations that trembled through her skin. She felt them circling her, cradling her terror, weaving it into something that was no longer weakness. The same tears that mocked her in life now glimmered in the soil, their salt merging with the earth's hidden veins. Her lungs still burned, her body still writhed, but somewhere deep within, defiance sparked. If the world above had cast her out, perhaps the world beneath would claim her. Her terror sharpened into a vow that even without breath, even without light, she would not be silenced. Her cries might be buried, but they would not vanish. The earth seemed to agree. The hum became a rumble, so faint no villager above would hear it, yet to her it was deafening. The soil pressed harder, but not to destroy her, to mold her, to fuse her with its strength. Darkness surrounded her completely, but in that darkness she felt the stirring of unseen forces, ancient and vengeful, rising with her final breaths. She was buried alive, yet not alone. The soil that sought to choke her now listened, the roots that bound her now reached for her, and the silence of death became the echo of something waiting to awaken. The villagers thought they had silenced her before sunrise, but beneath the breathless soil, a storm was gathering. The night crept over the land slowly, as if the sun itself hesitated to leave, knowing what was about to awaken. The villagers went about their routines with a forced normalcy, though whispers lingered in the corners of huts and by the flickering fire pits. Everyone knew she had been buried before dawn, though none dared to speak it aloud. Her absence hung in the air, heavier than the heat of the day. But as twilight deepened and shadows lengthened, the earth itself began to stir where her body had been hidden. At first it was subtle, a soft shiver of soil, a faint tremble as if roots beneath the ground were writhing uneasily. The mound rose and fell like a chest struggling for breath, and those few who lingered nearby clutched at their garments, swearing the earth itself sighed. The first sound came just as the last rays of sun dipped below the horizon, a muffled groan, low and aching, like the voice of someone speaking through stone. Children were hushed and pulled inside, their mothers barring the doors with shaking hands. The elders sat stiffly by their fires, refusing to look toward the burial ground, though their ears strained for every sound. The night was not like others. The crickets fell silent, owls stilled their wings, and the air grew so heavy that even the torches seemed reluctant to burn. The earth shuddered once more, and this time it was undeniable, something beneath it moved with purpose. Then came the moment no one could deny. The soil cracked. At first it was just a fissure, thin and narrow, but with each passing heartbeat it widened, coughing up clumps of dirt. From beneath, pale fingers clawed their way to the surface, nails broken and bloody but determined. The earth, once thought to be her tomb, became her cradle of rebirth. With one last violent heave, she pulled herself free, gasping as though she had been holding her breath for an eternity. The moonlight fell upon her face, but it was not the same face they remembered. It was her, yet not her. Her skin glowed faintly, drained of warmth yet touched by an otherworldly pallor. Her eyes shimmered, reflecting both sorrow and fury, and around her, shadows stirred like loyal companions summoned from the abyss. She rose slowly, every movement deliberate, her breath shallow but steady. Dirt clung to her body, but instead of diminishing her, it seemed to cloak her in power, like an armor gifted by the earth itself. She stood barefoot, yet the ground beneath her feet quivered, acknowledging her claim. Behind her, the shadows stretched unnaturally long, twisting into vague human-like shapes that shifted and swayed with her heartbeat. They whispered in tones only the guilty could hear, voices heavy with accusation, voices of ancestors and spirits long forgotten. Wherever she turned her gaze, the night seemed to bend, as if even the darkness obeyed her return. Word of her rising spread like wildfire. A shepherd boy, too frightened to move, saw her silhouette against the moonlit horizon and dropped his staff, fleeing toward the village with cries of terror. Soon, doors creaked open and fearful faces peeked into the night. When they saw her, they fell to their knees, trembling, whispering prayers that had long lost meaning. But the guilty ones, those who had bound her wrists, pressed their hands against the soil to bury her, and laughed as the earth swallowed her cries. They could not hide. Their hearts beat louder than drums, drawing her gaze like iron pulled toward a magnet. She began to walk. The earth did not resist her steps. The wind carried her presence, chilling even the warmest hearth. Dogs howled, babies wailed, and grown men wept openly, for they knew the girl who had been wronged had not returned as flesh alone. She was touched by something greater, something older than memory, older than the village, older than fear itself. She was not merely alive. She was reborn in vengeance, carrying with her the weight of betrayal and the breath of the grave. And as the night deepened, the shadows at her back multiplied, swirling like a gathering storm that had chosen her as its vessel. One by one, lamps extinguished without a touch of wind. Silence fell heavy upon the land, broken only by her steady steps and the rustle of shadows keeping pace. Those who had wronged her tried to flee into the forest, but the trees themselves seemed to close their paths, branches knotting together like bars of a prison. Others fell upon their knees, clawing at the dirt, begging forgiveness from a girl who no longer belonged to the world of mercy. Her eyes glimmered, reflecting lightning that had not yet split the sky. She looked upon them not as humans, but as prey waiting for the storm to claim them. By midnight, the village no longer breathed as it once did. It held its air, waiting for the inevitable reckoning. The girl, pale and changed, walked among them, not speaking a word. She did not need to. Her presence was a curse, her silence heavier than thunder. Shadows trailed her like a crown, and with every heartbeat, the guilty felt the soil beneath them pulse, as if it too remembered their crime. She had risen, and with her rise, the night itself had awakened. The village woke with unease the morning after her return. No one spoke openly of what they had seen in the night, yet the fear was thick in the air, clinging like smoke after a fire. Mothers hushed their children when they asked why the dogs had howled so furiously or why the lamps had blown out all at once. The elders, usually so confident in their wisdom, avoided one another's gaze, for they too had heard the whispers and seen the pale figure rising from the earth. And though the sky stretched blue and clear above, the villagers felt as though a storm still hung over them, hidden, waiting to strike. It began with whispers, the kind that creep from mouth to mouth, quick and poisonous. Some said they had seen her standing at the edge of the fields, her dress still stained with soil, her eyes fixed on the huts of the guilty. Others claimed that her shadow moved independently, stretching farther than any human shadow should, bending across the earth like a serpent searching for prey. By midday, these whispers had become the only sound in the village. Men refused to go to their farms, women clutched charms and talismans, and even the children, usually bold and loud, kept silent, sensing the terror that hung over their parents. The guilty, though they tried to act like the rest, could not conceal the truth. Their hands trembled as they lifted cups of water, their eyes darted nervously at every movement, every flicker of shadow. It was not only her presence that haunted them, it was the omens that had begun to strike. One man, who had tied the ropes around her wrists, woke to find his hands covered in sores, as though invisible flames had burned him during sleep. Another, who had shoveled earth onto her face, claimed he heard scratching beneath his floor at night, soft at first, then furious as though something clawed to reach him from beneath the ground. Animals too seemed unsettled. Goats bleated endlessly, refusing to feed. Crows gathered on rooftops, staring down with black eyes that gleamed too knowingly. Chickens laid no eggs, cows gave no milk, and even the dogs, loyal companions of the village, growled low whenever the guilty passed by, their hackles rising as if they sensed rot in living flesh. The air was thick with dread, and even the wind seemed to whisper her name. At night, the villagers swore they could hear faint singing, a woman's voice carried on the breeze, sad and hollow, yet unbearably haunting. The guilty heard it louder than the rest, and each syllable pierced their hearts like a curse. Soon sleep abandoned them. Dreams became poisoned, filled with visions of her pale face staring from the darkness, her eyes unblinking, her hands reaching from beneath the earth. Some woke screaming, their sheets damp with sweat, while others swore they felt cold fingers brushing their throats as they slept. Fires crackled strangely in their homes, sparks jumping without reason, smoke forming shapes that looked too much like her silhouette. The village healers tried to intervene, offering herbs, charms and prayers, but nothing eased the fear. The guilty grew gaunt, sleepless and hollow-eyed, as if the life was being drained from them by the very air they breathed. The rest of the village trembled and shared fear. They had not buried her, yet they had allowed it to happen. Their silence had been a kind of guilt, and now they wondered if her vengeance might not stop with the guilty alone. Children cried at night, asking if she would come for them too, and mothers could not answer. Men carried spears but dared not step outside once the sun set, for none believed a weapon could pierce what had risen from the grave. The elders called secret meetings, debating whether to confess, to beg forgiveness, or to flee. But where could they go? She was no longer bound to the soil of their village. She had become something greater, something the wind carried, something the sky itself seemed to shelter. Strange signs continued to multiply. The river, once clear and bright, ran dark for a day, its waters tasting of earth and iron. The fig tree at the edge of the village where children had once played, withered overnight, its branches curling like fingers in pain. Lightning flashed across the sky without thunder, striking no ground but burning bright enough to sear fear into every witness. The guilty clutched their chests, gasping as though invisible hands squeezed their hearts whenever these omens appeared. Some fell to their knees, begging the ancestors for mercy. But the ancestors, it seemed, had already chosen sides. By the third night, no one doubted any longer. The whispers solidified into certainty. The girl had returned. She was not merely alive, nor was she merely a spirit. She was both, flesh touched by shadow, blood mixed with earth, a soul bound to the storm. The villagers trembled as they spoke of her, lowering their voices, fearing she might hear even from afar. They avoided her burial site, yet some swore they saw her pale figure standing there at night, her hair moving though no wind blew, her eyes glowing faintly like coals in the dark. And always the shadows clung to her, twisting and writhing as though alive, whispering promises of retribution. The guilty, once proud and arrogant, now huddled in their homes, afraid to look at one another, for in each other's faces they saw their own doom reflected. Their families grew restless, children crying at the smell of rot that clung to their clothes, wives turning away in fear. Neighbors shunned them, not daring to share food or water. It was as though an invisible mark had been burned upon their brows, announcing to all that they were chosen for punishment. And so the village trembled, caught between silence and screams, waiting for the storm they knew would come. They whispered in the dark, clutching charms, praying to gods who no longer listened. For the dead girl had risen, and with her return, the world of the living and the world of the dead had shifted. Nothing could remain the same. The night was heavy, the air thick with silence, as though the world itself was holding its breath. No dogs barked, no crickets sang, and no wind stirred the tall grass outside the village. The huts stood in uneasy stillness, their fires dimmed to faint embers, their doors barred more from fear than for protection. It was in this silence that she came. Step by step, her bare feet pressed against the earth that had once suffocated her, carrying her closer to the village that had betrayed her. The soil still clung to her skin like a second garment, pale dust covering her hands and arms, but her eyes, oh her eyes, burned with something no grave could smother. They glowed with the memory of earth pressing against her chest, with the terror of suffocation, and with the dark promise of vengeance. Those who dared peek through cracks in their walls saw her first. Some swore her figure was both solid and not, her body casting a shadow yet moving as though shadows obeyed her will. Her hair, once tied neatly by her own hands, now hung loose and wild, dusted with grave soil, strands falling across her glowing eyes. She said nothing as she walked, and it was her silence that struck deeper than any scream. Every villager who looked upon her felt it. She was no longer one of them. She was something reborn, carved out of earth and night, carrying with her the breath of the grave. The guilty ones stirred in their huts, restless, unable to sleep since the night she rose. They felt her presence before they saw her, a weight pressing on their lungs, a chill crawling over their skin. One man rose in panic, clutching his chest, whispering, "She comes." Another tried to light his lamp, but the flame refused to catch, sputtering and dying as though even fire feared her. Mothers clutched their children close, covering their mouths to keep them from crying, terrified that a single sound might draw her gaze. Fathers sat frozen, gripping spears they did not believe would save them. She entered the village without a word, her steps steady, her face expressionless. And yet her silence was filled with accusation, her very breath carrying the weight of justice. The air shifted as she passed. Fires flickered and died, Shadows lengthened unnaturally, and the earth itself seemed to hum beneath her feet. No one dared move. No one dared breathe. The village became a prison of silence and she its warden. Her eyes drifted across the huts, and though she spoke no words, the guilty knew she saw them. Their hearts thudded like drums in their chests, pounding louder than the silence that smothered the air. They remembered the weight of the earth they had shoveled onto her body, the sound of her muffled cries beneath the soil, and the cruel satisfaction that had guided their hands. Now, with each step she took, their memories twisted into blades, cutting deeper with every heartbeat. She did not need to accuse them aloud. Their own guilt shouted louder than any storm. One of them, unable to bear it, burst from his hut, falling to his knees before her. His voice cracked with desperation as he pleaded for forgiveness, his tears mixing with the dust at her feet. But she only looked at him, and in that look was all the silence of the grave. His cries grew louder, echoing into the night, but she remained unmoved. The others watched from their hiding places, trembling, knowing that his fate was merely the beginning. Her steps took her to the center of the village, where the fire pit smoldered with dying embers. She stood there, still as a stone, the entire village forced to watch. The fire sputtered once, as though struggling for life, and then went out completely, plunging the village into a darkness lit only by the glow of her eyes. In that moment, every soul knew, the night did not belong to them anymore. It belonged to her. Children wept softly in their mother's arms, while the elders whispered prayers to the ancestors. Yet no prayer seemed strong enough to counter the presence of the girl who had returned from beneath the soil. She was no longer just a girl. She was vengeance made flesh, a voice of the earth itself, walking in silence but carrying storms within her veins. Her gaze swept once more across the village, and this time the guilty felt the air tighten around them. Some clutched their throats, gasping as though invisible hands strangled them. Others collapsed to the ground, trembling, their eyes wide with terror as they realized their doom had stepped into their midst. But she did not move toward them, not yet. She only stood, her silence promising that their judgment had only begun. The night held her there, a figure both terrifying and beautiful, radiant with the earth's cold light. Every villager, guilty or not, knew the truth in their bones. She had returned not as one of them but as something greater. And she would not leave until every debt of blood was paid. The night thickened, pressing upon the village like a suffocating shroud. No stars glimmered above, no moon shed light upon the earth. The only illumination came from her eyes, twin embers glowing in the blackness, guiding her silent steps through the huts. The villagers dared not move, their breaths shallow, their hearts thundering against their ribs. They knew this was the night of reckoning, the night her silence would finally break, not with words, but with the justice no mortal hand could stop. It began with the man who had lifted the first spade of earth to bury her. He stirred in his hut, sweat dripping from his brow though the night was cool. A sound came, a whisper not of a voice but of shifting soil, as though the earth itself had come to reclaim him. Shadows gathered at his feet, curling like black smoke, climbing his legs as he screamed. But his cries were short-lived. The darkness wrapped around him, pulling him down as though the ground beneath had opened, and in moments his hut stood empty, save for the faint smell of soil and the echo of his last gasp. Others tried to flee, but the night was no longer theirs. One woman, who had pressed the cloth over the girl's mouth to muffle her cries as the soil piled high, ran into the street, clutching a torch. Yet the flames sputtered and died the moment she stepped outside, leaving her swallowed by shadows. She screamed once, twice, then her body jerked violently as unseen hands dragged her into the darkness between huts. The silence that followed was more terrifying than her cries. One by one the guilty felt it, the shadows creeping close, slithering beneath doors and through cracks in walls. They tried to bar their huts, to shut out the night, but what lock could keep out vengeance? One man found his walls trembling, his roof shaking as though caught in a storm. Then the soil beneath him gave way and he fell, clawing at the ground, until the earth closed over him with a dull thud. His family wailed in terror, but none dared follow, for they knew he had been claimed. The survivors, those who had taken no part in the crime, watched in horror, their eyes wide, their hands clutching each other. They dared not speak, dared not even pray aloud, for fear the shadows might mistake them for the guilty. They could only watch as their neighbors vanished one after another, dragged into darkness that gave no mercy. Each disappearance was swift, merciless, and final. The guilty tried to shout apologies, begging forgiveness, but their words dissolved into screams as the shadows silenced them. By midnight the village was alive with terror. The guilty had dwindled, their huts left hollow and echoing with the memory of their crimes. Each time a life was claimed, the air grew heavier, as if the village itself was sinking into an abyss of sorrow and vengeance. The living clung to each other, their eyes darting to the glowing figure of the girl who stood unmoving in the center of the square. She did not need to raise her hand, did not need to speak. Her presence was enough. The shadows obeyed her grief, her pain, her need for justice. No scream lasted till morning. The cries of the guilty were cut short, choked by soil, drowned by darkness, silenced by unseen forces that tore them from the world. By the time the horizon began to pale, only silence remained. The huts stood still, some with doors ajar where the guilty had fled, others trembling as if still haunted by the voices that once filled them. The village was scarred, emptied of laughter, emptied of cruelty, emptied of those who had thought they could bury innocence. And there, at the heart of it all, the girl remained, her glowing eyes now dimming as the first touch of dawn crept over the earth. She had not spoken, had not raised her hand, yet vengeance had answered her suffering. The night had claimed those who buried her, and the morning would rise over a village forever changed. The first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, yet they brought no warmth, no relief. The sun rose pale and muted, as though it too feared to shine upon the village that had betrayed innocence. The morning light spilled across the land, but instead of chasing away the shadows, it revealed a scene more dreadful than any nightmare. The village stood hollow as though emptied of life overnight. Homes that once echoed with laughter and cruelty alike now sat silent. Doors hung ajar, swinging weakly with the morning breeze. Cooking pots lay overturned, their contents long grown cold. Mats were scattered, tools abandoned, as if the people inside had been swallowed whole while clutching their daily lives. Yet there were no bodies, no blood, no trace of the guilty who had been taken. It was as though the night had reached into the marrow of the village and plucked them away, leaving behind only empty shells of homes. The air itself was thick with something unnatural. Birds that usually greeted the dawn did not sing. No chickens clucked, no dogs barked. The silence pressed against the ears of the living like a heavy weight, broken only by the faint rustle of wind moving through grass. The survivors, those few who had not raised hands against the girl, stumbled out of their homes, their eyes wide with terror, their skin pale and clammy. They whispered among themselves, voices trembling, afraid that even words might draw the vengeance that still lingered. "Where are they?" one woman asked, clutching her child to her chest. Her hut, once shared with her husband, was now hollow, the mat on which he had slept indented but empty. "Where has he gone?" But no one answered. For all around the story was the same. Husbands missing, wives vanished, children gone. The guilty had been erased as though the earth itself had opened its jaws and devoured them. Those who remained knew with trembling hearts that they had witnessed a punishment beyond human reckoning. The square in the center of the village told the most haunting tale. It was there the girl had once been mocked, her cries met with cruel laughter. Now the square stood deserted, its soil uneven, marked with strange depressions, as if invisible hands had dragged bodies down into the ground and left no trace. The earth smelled damp, raw, freshly turned, though no spade had touched it since the night before. Survivors dared not step too close. To them, the square had become a grave, though no bodies lay within sight. And there, at the very edge of the square, faint footprints lingered. Small, delicate, yet deep, as if pressed by feet that carried a weight far greater than flesh. They led away from the square, winding between huts, across the village and out into the distance. The footprints ended abruptly at the edge of the forest, where shadows still lingered despite the rising sun. The villagers knew who had left them and none dared follow. Fear grew heavier with every passing moment of the ruined dawn. Mothers held their children closer, whispering prayers into their ears. Elders who had once dismissed the girl's suffering now sat trembling, muttering to themselves about curses and justice. The air smelled faintly of soil and smoke, though no fires burned. Even the wind seemed wrong, it carried a chill despite the warmth of the sun, as though it had blown straight from a grave. The few who tried to speak of what had happened found their voices faltering. How could they describe a night where the dead had returned, where shadows obeyed grief, where vengeance had been more real than flesh? Some insisted the girl still walked, her faceless vengeance continuing just beyond sight. Others swore they heard faint sounds in the distance, not laughter, not crying, but the muffled thuds of earth closing over bodies again and again. The memory of her burned into every corner of the village. Each hut seemed haunted, each path too silent, each well too deep. Even when survivors looked at their own reflections in bowls of water, they flinched, fearing they might see her glowing eyes staring back. No one dared speak her name, yet everyone thought of her with every step, every glance, every breath. By mid-morning, the truth had settled over the survivors like a shroud. The village was cursed, hollow, doomed to carry the weight of what had been done. No amount of prayer, sacrifice, or rebuilding could erase the memory of that night. They had buried innocence before sunrise, but by night she had returned and claimed what was hers. And now the land itself bore the scar of her vengeance. The ruined dawn was not simply a mourning. It was a reminder. Every empty hut, every vanished life, every trembling breath of the survivors testified to the curse they had brought upon themselves. The sun climbed higher in the sky, yet its light never seemed to reach the heart of the village. For there, in every shadow, in every silence, the memory of the girl lived on. And so the day began not with the promise of life, but with the heavy certainty of doom. The village was a hollow shell, cursed by her memory, bound forever to the tale of the girl they had buried alive. They called her the girl who carried the earth in her lungs, the one who should have died before sunrise but rose with the night instead. Her tale did not remain in one hollow village, nor within the whispers of the frightened survivors who scattered after the cursed dawn. It grew wings and spread across rivers, forests, and deserts, carried from mouth to mouth like a secret too heavy to remain hidden. Mothers repeated it when their children quarreled, fathers retold it when envy sparked in young hearts, and elders passed it down as a warning etched into the marrow of every generation. The earth remembers, and innocence buried unjustly will never lie silent. The legend always began the same way. She had been a gentle girl, one who never raised her voice, who gave her bread even when she was hungry, who helped mend neighbors' roofs when the rains tore them apart. And yet, it was that very gentleness which others envied. Cruelty often strikes not because of evil deeds, but because kindness exposes the smallness in others. Her stepkin and rivals plotted against her, believing that her silence meant weakness, that her obedience meant she would not fight back. They thought burying her before the sun's first light would make her vanish as though she had never existed. But the earth has memory and the sky does not forgive. As the tale spread, it transformed into a teaching. Parents would lean close to their children at night, warning, never shed the blood of the blameless. Never turn envy into action. For the buried rise with the night and shadows follow them. Children would shiver, imagining the soft shuffle of footsteps in the dark, the sound of breathing that was not human but carried the weight of the soil. Some swore that when storms rolled in and thunder cracked the skies, they could hear her heartbeat in the rumble, a pulse that had once been stilled beneath the dirt but was now eternal. The story also became ritual. In certain villages, when someone was buried, people placed flowers of bright colors over the grave, not merely as a gesture of mourning but as an act of respect. They whispered apologies to the earth, asking it to accept the body gently, promising that no injustice had been done. Children were told to never step on a grave, never laugh too loudly in a burial ground, for the buried girl might hear and rise again. Her legend made the soil sacred, and the act of laying someone to rest became something heavy with reverence, as though the world itself might punish carelessness. Travelers brought the story into marketplaces, where it was retold with variations that only made it stronger. Some said her eyes glowed with fire when she returned, others swore her hair was full of crawling earthworms, still dripping with the mud that had once smothered her. Others whispered that she spoke no words but only breathed, and that breath carried the scent of graves, a wind that could snatch guilty souls and drag them away. Each version carried the same truth at its heart. She was innocence wronged and vengeance wearing the face of a girl who had once been kind. Generations later, her name was forgotten, but her title was not. She became the buried girl, a figure invoked whenever envy flared or whenever cruelty rose in households. Do not become like those villagers, the elders would say, for their homes are gone, their names erased, and their bloodlines scattered into shadows. Do not bury what is innocent, for the earth will one day unearth it and send it back to claim you. The fear of her tale lived in every act of kindness people tried to show, as if to undo the crime their ancestors had once committed. And though many swore the story was only a myth, others would lower their voices and say that they had seen her. In the far reaches of the land, in villages that had never known her face, some whispered that a pale figure sometimes walked at night, barefoot and silent, her eyes glowing like embers. She never spoke, but those who had buried the innocent claimed they heard her in their dreams, the rustle of soil, the weight of footsteps climbing out of the grave. Some men woke gasping for air, clawing at their throats as if suffocation had returned to them. Some women claimed to see shadows gather by their beds, as though the buried girl had come to count them among the guilty. Thus her story endured, sharper than iron, heavier than stone. It was more than a tale, it was a curse woven into memory. Parents reminded their children of her not to frighten them, but to teach them the deepest truth: the world does not forget injustice. The rivers may dry, the forests may burn, the skies may shift, but the earth beneath our feet remembers. And when innocence is buried, it does not rest. It rises. It returns. It claims. The buried girl lived on not in flesh but in legend, a reminder that cruelty never buries itself quietly. She was both warning and justice, both fear and memory. Her footsteps could still be heard whenever storms rolled across the land, whenever dawn broke hollow in villages where envy thrived. And long after her body had turned to dust, her spirit walked eternal, whispering the truth every parent taught their child: the earth remembers and the buried always return.